All right, so when you hear the word Stasi, what's the first thing that pops into your head? Probably some shadowy figure in a trench coat pulling a perfectly labeled manila folder out of a giant filing cabinet, right? Well, what if I told you the real story is way stranger, a lot more sophisticated, and honestly, kind of terrifyingly relevant to your life right now? We're going to pull back the curtain on the Stasi's secret method, and it all starts not with the person, but with a pattern.
Yeah, this is the picture we all have, isn't it? This idea of a state that has its eyes on everyone, with a neat, tidy file for every single citizen, all indexed perfectly by name. It's a really simple and powerful image of what total control looks like.
But here's the twist. The historical record shows that whole one file per person thing, it's pretty much a myth. The Stasi's real method was something else entirely. It was a system that didn't start with a name, or a face, or any kind of identity. Nope. It started with anonymous whispers, echoes in the noise.
And there it is. That's the secret sauce. This is the fundamental shift in thinking that powered their whole operation. So just forget the individual file. The Stasi's #1 target was the pattern. Repeated behaviors, weird coincidences, connections that just sort of emerge from the static of everyday life. The actual person? Oh, they came way, way later in the game. So how did they do this? They built what the source material calls an information blob, and I love that term. Think of it like a ghost in the machine. It's just a collection of related scraps. A certain writing style over here, a phone call from a particular payphone over there. All of it seems connected, but you have no idea who's behind it. It's a hypothesis with no face.
Now, to build these blobs, you need data. A lot of data. I mean, at their peak, the Stasi were intercepting and reading over 90,000 letters every single day. That is a fire hose of information. And they weren't just looking for secrets. They were harvesting the raw materials to build their patterns. And the stuff they collected was, well, it was everything. We're talking anonymous leaflets, the unique little quirks of one specific typewriter, tips from informants about someone's daily habits, even the kind of paper or ink used in a letter. Each little piece was basically meaningless on its own, but once you start putting them together, that's when it gets powerful. And this is where it gets really clever. The Stasi analysts used techniques that feel surprisingly modern to connect all these dots. They'd look for things happening at the same time or on the same day of the week. They'd map out where different events happened to see if they overlapped. They were basically analog data scientists building a complete picture out of all these scattered anonymous clues. So one of these blobs would start out as what they called a hint complex. Just think of it as an analyst's hunch, a cool theory with no real resources behind it. But if that pattern started to look a little too organized, a little too threatening, it got promoted to an operative case. And that's the moment the ghost in the machine stopped being a curiosity and became an official enemy of the state. So what was the tipping point? Well, it was anything that suggested someone was organized. A bunch of anti-government leaflets showing up in the same neighborhood over and over. Regular phone calls to a journalist in the West. Anything that hinted that this blob had access to something like a printing press. The second a blob looked less like one person and more like a whole network, all the alarms went off. Which, of course, brings us to the big question. We've got this whole process, this pattern, this anonymous threat, but where's the actual person in all this? Well, it was only after an anonymous blob was flagged as a major threat that the Stasi finally started the hardest part, trying to put a name to the ghost. This whole process was called personification. It was the very last piece of their puzzle. They'd use their informants to get a list of names, get forensics to match handwriting to a suspect, and put tails on people to see if their movements in the real world match the blob's patterns. It was all about taking this cloud of probability and collapsing it onto one single human being. But here's the thing. It often didn't work. For all their effort, they frequently failed. Sometimes they pinned the blob on the wrong person, completely destroying an innocent life in the process. And sometimes the blob just stayed a ghost forever, a coherent pattern of resistance that they could see but could never, ever pin on anyone. Okay, so this is the point where a strange story about the Cold War suddenly becomes, well, our story. Because that weird pattern-first logic that the Stasi used, it didn't die when the Berlin Wall fell. In fact, it's more alive today than ever. It just got a massive digital upgrade. That information blob the Stasi built, sound familiar? It should. It's the direct ancestor of the digital identity clusters that advertisers and surveillance companies build about you and me today.
They scoop up all the fragments of our online lives, our clicks, our searches, our location, to build a pattern of who we are, usually without ever needing our actual name. Remember their huge index of all the little flaws on different typewriters? Well, today, that's what we call a device fingerprint. It's a unique signature made from your browser settings, your fonts, and your hardware that can identify your specific phone or laptop out of millions, even if you're trying to be anonymous.
And that giant web of human informants they use to map out who knew who? Today, that's just a social graph. It's an automatic map of all our friendships and connections, built from our contact lists, our likes, and who we follow.
So, what's the big takeaway here? It's pretty simple and honestly a little chilling. Modern digital surveillance is not some radical new invention. It's just a scaled-up, high-tech version of the exact same pattern-first philosophy that the Stasi pioneered with paper, ink, and wiretaps. The tools are brand new, but the logic is identical. Which leaves us with a really critical question for our own time. In a world that profiles our patterns of behavior long before it ever knows our name, a world that builds a blob out of our data to predict what we're going to do next, what does that mean for your identity, for your freedom? What does it mean for the very idea of who you are?